Yeah, that's it.
I can bellow. Okay, thank you very much everyone for coming, particularly those that have come a long way. Thank you to all the people at All Truth Juice for putting this on and for you know, all the work that goes into this. It does take a lot of work to keep this going and to get all the equipment set up and everything and to back up. So thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to Charlotte for helping me with the DVDs and things. I'm not really here to sell books, but I do have a few books with me, and I want to mention one in particular because some of you will know of this. I've brought it a few times. Where Did the Towers Go? I've got, I think, a couple of copies left here. I have got some more in another box. I wasn't sure how many people were going to turn up tonight. I know it's 25 quid, but it's 500 pages, glossy, full colour, meticulous research by Dr. Judy Wood, who's a former professor of mechanical engineering. It's the book that nobody wants to talk about in the 9/11 truth movement. I'm exaggerating slightly because we are making some inroads finally. But this is just evidence. Won't tell you who did 9/11, but it will tell you what happened to the World Trade Center. Did you want to say something? All right, okay. And I've got a couple of other books. I've got my book, 9/11 Finding the Truth, which is about the cover-up of that book, which I've gone into a lot of detail about. That's available free from my website as electronic download, Kindle format, iPad format, free. And there's also an audio book version of that, so you can listen to it while you're on the bus or while you're driving around. Carl James's book, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. So anybody who's interested in science fiction, this will give you some of the connections between some of the authors and the directors, film directors, that they have to things like some of these secret societies and stuff. Very interesting book. And then finally, I've got a couple of copies of this book, that book, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda. PDF is available free from my website. I only bring these because I have to pay, you know, to get the paperbacks printed. I don't make anything on them. Same with this, Alien Rapture, that's Edgar Fouché's book. He's written this as fiction. Edgar Fouché, I've got a whole other presentation with him. I interviewed him for about 6 hours on YouTube. Anybody that wants links to any of this information tonight, go to checktheevidence.com, click on the contact button, write to me, and I'll send you whatever information I can, you know, based on anything I say tonight. But that's about his experiences in Area 51, Nellis Air Force Base, fictionalised, and for example talks about the alien autopsy from Roswell. There's a bit about that in here, which he got some information on, attachment D as it's called, and various other things. It's basically about what the US government knows about basically recovered technology and that sort of thing. So, as I say, I'm not here to sell books, but if you do want access to some of that information, I've got some of it here tonight, so you'll be saving yourself something on postage, etc. Right, so tonight's topic, we're going to be talking about NASA data primarily. So this is something that you can go and look at NASA's website. I've got all the links. If anybody wants to look at specific pictures, make a little note of it or somehow. What's that picture about Mars or whatever, and I'll send you the links. Okay, no problem. We're going to look at data from Mars, Phobos, which is an unusual moon of Mars, Iapetus, the Sun, which has got this SOHO probe looking at it, amongst other ones. There's a new one since SOHO went up. And we're going to ask, are most scientists deliberately ignoring the most intriguing data that's coming back from these probes? Does the data indicate life and intelligence, past or present, elsewhere in the solar system? That's the question I'm posing. I don't have a definite answer to that, I have a probable answer to that. And this isn't all my research, I'm basically piecing together a lot of other research that's been done by a lot of other people.
You want sound on?
No, it's all right. I will in a minute, yeah, but... Yeah. So we're going to start off with a very brief look at lunar anomalies. These are the slides I inserted a few weeks ago. It's curious, but we get... Somebody wrote to me about this the other day. Even though the moon is the closest to us, we seem to have less interesting pictures about anomalies on the moon than we do from Mars, for example. Here's one that I came across. This is taken, I think, in 1962 from 1967, Lunar Orbiter 3, and you can see how would a crater, which is meant to be either from a volcano of some type or an impact, you know, a large rock hitting it, how can it have a hexagonal shape rather? Very strange. And again, you can go and find that with this image reference on the Space Exploration Resources from Arizona State University. And then we've got this peculiar crater. How could this have formed? We've got this little nick at the top here. This is called the Ukert crater. So again, I can send you the links for that. No clear answers to some of these images. I don't have an answer, but that doesn't look like a standard sort of volcanic eruption. It has a certain symmetry to it down here. And then I came across this one, which was taken by, even India have got a probe going around the moon now. That went up a few years ago. But when I went to look for this image, because I got this image about a year ago, I think it was, and I went back to look for it again recently to check on it, and that original image has now disappeared from the Indian Space Research Archive. I had to get it from the Internet Archive. So it's this strange mound here. It doesn't really look, it's very unusual compared to what other things that you see on the moon. I don't know what it is. So that's just to tell you that there are even anomalies on the moon. Now, you get disinformation about this as well. I'm going to cover some of that disinformation a little bit tonight, forget time. But people like Richard Hoagland have claimed that there are these structures, glass pyramids on the moon and stuff like this. And he bases that on images from the Apollo program. But if you were here a few months ago when I talked about Apollo, I don't believe that Richard Hoagland is telling the truth about Apollo, because I'm pretty sure, 99% sure, they didn't land on the moon with the Apollo program. But that's another presentation, which you can watch online, by the way, if you want. But so we're going to get into this now in more detail by looking at Mars. And you can clearly see a pattern becomes apparent when you look at what they've said about Mars. So just to give you a little bit of information about Mars, the mass is basically 1/10 of the Earth. The volume is about 15% of the Earth. The equatorial radius is about half of the Earth, and the polar radius is also about half of the Earth. So it's about, you can see it's about half the diameter of the Earth. The mean density is 0.713 of what the Earth is, and the surface gravity is about 1/3, a bit over 1/3. Okay? And it's, I think it's slightly further away than Venus. It's the second nearest planet to us. And we're going to look at some of the information about the space probes that have gone to Mars. So over 50 probes have gone to Mars since the 1960s. The first attempt was made in the Russian Marsnik program with Marsnik 1 in 1960, but most of the early attempts failed. Mariner 4 was the first successful probe flyby, and that took place in July 1965. And that was actually covered by this chap I've already mentioned, Richard Hoagland, who runs a website called enterprisemission.com. He does have a lot of very interesting information. Again, I could do easily another half an hour on that guy. There have been over 50 mission attempts, as I said, and the USA and Russia have both sent probes. I think the US have probably sent a few more. The most sophisticated to date is the Curiosity rover, which quite a lot of press about that, and I'll talk about that a bit later. And I will mention what was covered on Richard D. Hall's programme a few months ago. I'll just mention that briefly. That's not the focus of tonight's presentation. And that's one of the earlier Mariner 4 pictures that was returned, very grainy as you can see. So the journey of discovery with Mars, I would argue, starts with Viking 1 and 2, really. They were probes that each consisted of a lander and an orbiter. In other words, something went round the planet and then something that detached from the orbiter and landed on the surface. The mission objectives were to obtain high-resolution images of the Martian surface, characterise the structure and composition of the atmosphere and surface, and search for evidence of life. Right? And I always point out this when I do this presentation. This arm here, which came out of the probe, it was like a long telescopic arm, dug into the soil, withdrew a sample, and then the arm retracted again and dropped the sand into some chemicals to check if there were microbes in the sand. And that arm was designed by a British guy, and he was on Blue Peter, I think, in 1975 or 1976, because I remember watching it. Viking 2, Viking 1 was launched on August 20th, 1975. It takes about a year to get there. and it arrived at Mars on June 19th, 1976. Viking 2 was launched on September 9th, 1975 and arrived at Mars on 8th of July 1976. Now, bear in mind the total cost of the Viking project was $1 billion. That's in 1970s money. So for unmanned probes, it's a very, very expensive mission. Because the Curiosity rover mission, which happened most recently, that was also $1 billion, but that's 35 years later, basically. Now then, that experiment, well, I'm not going to talk, I've got a clip about this later, so I'm not going to talk about the details, but that experiment with the arm, which dug the soil, it claimed to get a positive result. NASA announced they discovered life on Mars in 1976, and I'm going to come back to that shortly. But this was the guy who designed the experiment, which analysed the chemicals in the soil. Gil Levin, Dr. Gil Levin, I'll come back to him. But the other thing that happened was when they got the first pictures, allegedly from the surface of Mars, they looked at these, and you're going to hear this story in a minute as well in a clip that I've got, and the original images they got looked like this. This is according to Richard Hoagland and Dr. Gilbert Levin. But then somebody in NASA Mission Control said, oh, that's not right, and they came round and they adjusted all the monitors and said, yeah, that's better, and they showed this picture on the right. And what you actually find is that if you take the original Viking images, which are available, I don't know if people know how these pictures are made, but a colour image can be made by taking 3 separate pictures, one through a red filter, one through a green filter, and one through a blue filter. So you take 3 black and white pictures, right, through each one of those colours, RGB, ever seen an RGB input on a TV? And then you mix those images together, and it means that with a black and white camera and colour filters you can generate a colour image. And so what this chap did, Holger Isenberg, you can go and look at his website, he downloaded the original black and white images for the Viking images, and he reprocessed them in Photoshop using NASA's filter specification for the red, green and blue filters that they used to take these images, and that was the image he got on the top there. Isn't that strange? And I've seen 3 different analyses saying basically the same thing. So, there was a documentary broadcast in 2009 by the BBC, and it was actually a re-edited repeat of a documentary that broadcast about Viking 30 years earlier. And I've got a clip from that. If it plays. Put some sound, please.
There's the first piece of information coming in.
Give.
Oh.
Say something, Phil.
Yeah, I'm supposed to say something at this point. I just don't feel like talking.
Well, there are rocks.
There are rocks, yes. There's rocks, and there's sediment, but it's just incredible to see that the Mars, is really there.
So you can see black and white images.
It's always a little bit hazardous. Nonetheless, many of these boulders do look very similar to ones that we've seen in desert terrains here. Some of these boulders may be vesicular, that is, basaltic rocks, possibly volcanic rocks that have solidified in a gas-charged environment, and they release gases, produce vesicles or holes. Just looks like a perfect set down.
The first picture of the Martian panorama.
As you look at the field of view in general, I think the most striking impression is one of a lot of rocks. And this automatically brings to mind the fact that we had a good deal of luck, because some of these rocks are about 2-3 meters across, and had the spacecraft landed on those rocks, it would have been disabled, probably permanently disabled.
Later high-resolution pictures confirmed the rocks were volcanic, but lying on dunes of fine sand. On the second day, the first pictures in color. Mars was indeed the red planet, or at any rate, blue-red. But the colors were false. It was noticed that one of the cables on the spacecraft wasn't orange enough. The color was corrected, and Mars turned even redder. reason for their mistake? The sky. Everyone had assumed it would be blue, like on Earth. But on Mars, scattered dust turns the sky pink and makes sunsets purple.
And you might have recognised the dulcet tones of William Franklin, who was a popular TV announcer and actor at the time. But something's not right. You'll notice that he said the colour of the cable was too orange. That is false. That is BBC false misinformation. On the Viking probe, they had colour calibration charts fitted to the probe, so that when they took pictures of these, they could tell what the colours should have been when they were viewed from Earth. So it had nothing to do with the colour of cables, right? They needed to disguise the fact that the sky is blue, not red. Now, latterly, some people have argued that that's because the rovers and landers aren't even on Mars. They're somewhere in the Mojave Desert or on Devon Island. I don't know if that's correct or not, but what I can tell you is the sky on Mars ain't red. And also the reason that they give for it being red is bogus, because they say it's due to scattered dust. Yet, because the atmosphere is very thin on Mars, I think it's something like less than 10% of the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere, how is the dust going to stay suspended? Because the air is much thinner. So the dust explanation is also bogus. And again, you can see this happening with some of the later probes. This is from the Spirit rover, which went up in 2004. They did the same thing again. Here, you've got this is the panel as was taken on Earth on the test rig. So this is green, this is sort of an orangey colour, brown, and this is blue. This is the key one. When they got this back from Mars, they said it was red. It's impossible, because this is colour by subtraction. So this panel here reflects only blue light. But if you've only got red light coming through the cloud, as they claim, how can red light change into blue? That would be a muddy grey. It wouldn't be red. You can't turn red to blue, not with transmitted light from not from reflected light. It's impossible, because if that was caused by red light, it would be muddy grey, because that's blue. If you see what I mean. So that is false. They're substituting colours. So somebody had done in Photoshop, they changed all the red hues into blue hues. Why would they do that? And then this is a later picture from 28th of July 2005. This isn't a NASA picture, this is an ESA picture, the European Space Agency, which is like the European counterpart to NASA, and I've got a few images from them as well. Excuse me, but why is that blue? That's meant to be ice. Is that reflecting? So is it reflecting the colour of the sky, maybe? I don't know, but that doesn't look right to me. And again, I can send you the link to that picture if you want to look at it. And here we've got two pictures, one from Mars Express, which is the ESA probe, and one from Mars Global Surveyor, which was launched in 1999. So not Viking pictures, in other words. I'm going to come back to some more Mars Global Surveyor images. What's this here? What's this green? Some people say that NASA has deliberately desensitized the filters on the orbiters to green light. Green is the colour of chlorophyll, which is the material in plants, leaves, grasses, which is responsible for photosynthesis. So why would they want to change it into that? Why do we get all these black and white images from Mars all the time? When everyone's got a high-resolution digital camera in their pocket now, pretty much. Now then, life on Mars was discovered again. So in 1976 they discovered it. Then they claimed it was a mistake. We'll come back to that. In July 2004, it was stated by Professor Vittorio Formisano that Mars Express, this is the ESA probe, so he's not from NASA, had detected ammonium, methane and even formaldehyde in the Martian atmosphere. These are called biomarker gases, indicating ongoing life processes. So that means that these gases have been generated by living organisms. You know, methane, cow farts, for example, as come into the news. Now, this is quoting Formisano. He said, "My observations should not be taken as a statement that there is life on Mars today, because we need to go there to drill the soil, take samples and analyse them before possibly concluding that life is there." I'm sorry, but this is 2004, and I've just told you how in 1976, they sent a probe which dug the soil and analysed the chemicals and detected life. Why would Formisano not mention Viking, a NASA mission? And then, methane on Mars again. NASA, methane clouds could be evidence for life on Mars. 5 years later, they did it again. Levin's experiment in 1976, that actually discovered methane as well. So NASA also keep discovering water. I'll come back to this. But so we've got the same story again 5 years later, reported as if it's a new discovery. Huh? Methane on Mars again. We've had a similar report again on December the 4th, 2012. Curiosity rover detects water and organic compounds on Mars. The rover also detected its first organic compounds in the form of chlorinated methane. Again, reported new again. That's 7 years later. But then they debunk it 13 days later days later on 13th of December as Discovery News reports, where's Mars's methane? Curiosity doors are blank. So then they say it didn't discover it. Here we go again. September 2013. NASA says there is no life on Mars. In the Daily Mail. And then December the 16th, 2014. Curiosity detects methane spike on Mars. So they're announcing these discoveries and then unannouncing them. Those are all headlines from either from NASA or Daily Mail or wherever. So these have all gone out to the public. You know, I don't have access to any whistleblowers or any secret information or anything like that. This is all public information. You can see they're playing games here. It's obvious that they're playing games. Now, this video is a combination of two things. You're going to see some moving Martian, I've called them microbes, that's why I put the question mark. This video was made by Ron Bennett, but it was silent. So what I did was I overlaid another chap called David Darling, and he's going to tell you more about the life detection experiment with the arm, you know, that dug the soil.
I believe that Viking found life, and I think that, maybe not intentionally, but scientists painted the wrong picture of what happened. You know, the message was put out that Viking found nothing more than unusual active chemicals in the soil, that basically Mars was dead. And that's had a profound effect on everything that's followed, including the direction of the whole space program. So the question is, where did things go wrong? Well, back in '76, two identical spacecraft, Viking 1 and 2, landed on Mars. They both carried miniature biology labs, kind of about the size of a microwave oven. It was quite small. But they had 3 experiments which were looking directly for life on Mars, and they were the first spacecraft to do this, and incredibly, the only spacecraft that have ever looked for life on another planet. You know, in the 30-odd years since then, we've never sent out another probe to look for life, and that's because the mainstream science said Viking didn't find anything. So, you know, they carried out some experiments. I just want to zero in a couple of them. One was called the label release experiment. One was called a pyrolytic release. And the agreement was beforehand, if any of these experiments found a positive signal, then we would say that they'd found life on Mars, and that was thrown out the window later on. So what the label release experiment did was it took a sample of Martian soil, it dripped some water onto it, some goodies, some nutrients, kind of like a chicken soup type of thing for bacteria. And the neat thing was that those nutrients were laced with radioactive carbon. And the hope was that any bugs in the soil would metabolize that food and they'd give off radioactive carbon dioxide, which you could then pick up with a radiation detector, Geiger counter. And lo and behold, that's exactly what it found. A big rush of radioactive carbon dioxide, which lasted for about 3 days. Exactly what you'd expect if there were bacteria in the soil. And not what you'd expect if there was a chemical reaction. It wouldn't last that long. There's no way. The other experiment, the pyrolytic release experiment, showed that organic chemicals were manufactured in the soil by something. That's kind of hard to explain without life going on. Mm-hmm. And these two together gave life signals. So why didn't scientists say that Viking had found life? Because according to the pre-agreed criteria before Viking ever left the launch pad, both of those experiments found life. The reason was there was another instrument on board Viking, which was called the GCMS. That stands for Gas Chromatograph Mass Spectrometer. And the whole purpose of that instrument was to look for organics, organic material, anything containing carbon, basically, in the Martian soil, and that came up negative. It didn't find a single thing. It didn't find a single carbon-containing molecule in the soil. And it was used as a court of appeal, basically. So you've got two experiments saying, yeah, there's life here by pre-agreed criteria. Another instrument says there can't be life, no organics, you can't have life. But that instrument wasn't working properly. And we know it wasn't working properly. It's been demonstrated. It was demonstrated even before Viking took off, although it wasn't really well known or advertised. But in several studies since then, identical equipment to the GCMS has been tested on Antarctic soils, on soils from deserts regions on Earth which are similar to Mars, and it has failed to find life where we know there is life by other instruments. And so this Court of Appeal instrument was faulty. It couldn't, we know it couldn't have detected organic material on Mars, and yet that's the way it panned out, that scientists used that as a way to say there's no life on Mars. So the GCMS found nothing, and so what did the Viking scientists team do? They dismissed the positive readings of the other two experiments. And they said that the activity in the soil was due to some kind of reactive chemical like hydrogen peroxide, and that was that.
So just to summarise what that was showing, as it says there, the Phoenix lander was another lander which went up, I forget the exact date, I think it was 2009, and it landed near the polar regions on Mars, and it worked for about 6 months, and it had a microscope on it, and they drilled it into the rocks, and that's where some of those images came from. Now NASA didn't make those animations. In other words, they didn't take one of the images that was taken and then flip that to another image that was taken of the same field half an hour later. That was done by Ron Bennett, who was an amateur researcher. So you've got amateur researchers doing experiments on NASA's own data that NASA are not doing. This is the problem. And then NASA are just ignoring the results. They're not sort of going along to Ron Bennett and saying, oh yeah, that's really interesting, thanks for doing that. We never thought of that, which is what they should be doing. And then I've just got various images like this, for example. What's this? And there's quite a few of these. I mean, maybe it is just a random collection of rocks. But we're going to see some that perhaps can't be that. And I'm going to come back to these again, but these are, I would agree, fossils in the rocks on Mars.